When I received my original next-gen APU info in February, I detailed an APU being tested at Microsoft that was RDNA 2, or at least close, and it had direct comparisons to the consoles with a 7nm plus Zen architecture. Now, one of the big focuses of this APU was supposedly a TDP down to 10 watts, although I was told that it could boost higher in other form factors. Back then, I speculated that it was either Cézanne or Van Gogh based on other code names out there, and the fact that it seemed to me like AMD was working backwards in history with artists based on their deaths. I chose Cézanne simply because, well, I saw that name pop up a lot more in the usual haunts I was told to look into, and honestly, I just kind of like the name more than Van Gogh, being a Francophile and all. However, I've also fairly consistently emphasized that Cézanne and Van Gogh's dates were close to each other in history, and so it really would be interesting if whoever came up with this code naming scheme knew art history well enough to make Cézanne and Van Gogh come out fairly close to each other. And while I have updated some of these thoughts in my recent AMD Multi-Mini Whispers video, it seems like I'm gonna have to do it already again based on some new information from X Preview summarizing some leaks that have recently come out of Komachi and others on Twitter, while adding a bit of their own information that they've been holding back on as well. In their article, they detail how Cézanne is, like I've said, Zen 3, but supposedly using Vega again instead of RDNA 2 on TSMC's 7nm process. And then there was also a mention of Rembrandt using Zen 3 Plus and RDNA 2, but on 6nm instead of my speculated 5nm. That honestly doesn't really surprise me, although again, AMD has to be using 5nm for something early next year. Anyways, back on subject, Van Gogh was also mentioned, and if you look closely at this, and then my old leak, it looks really familiar, doesn't it? So familiar that I just have to openly say, if my information I received in February and then this new set of rumors is correct, and those are still really assumptions until we see them released by AMD, then what I covered in February is probably Van Gogh. I did speculate on the name, and I'm sorry, when I look at this, RDNA 2, that was one thing my source back then was really specific about, the customizations and the graphics. And he was vague about which Zen generation it used, but hearing 7nm plus, I mean, I assumed Zen 3, because why not? But, you know what, here's the thing. Back then, no one was really talking about this 7nm enhanced process that we are seeing mentioned all the time now, since the Xbox Series X has had its big specs unveiling. And the fact of the matter is that N7P, this is not N7 Plus, you know, you gotta get the nomenclature correctly. Well, not full EUV, is a partial EUV node. And so without this being common discussion half a year ago, I could see why a source might just call this 7nm plus or 7nm EUV. After all, it was a partial EUV process, and no one was talking about anything but N7 and 7nm EUV back then. And so I do think that is Van Gogh based on these new rumors, most likely, because absolutely everything lines up. However, a lot of you might say, wait a second, Van Gogh is meant for low power devices? Didn't you detail 24 CUs? And I did, and I actually double checked my original information, and he didn't say Navi 24, he said 24 CU RDNA 2. So yes, if my information's correct, and it's Van Gogh should at least have a version with 24 compute units, although it is worth emphasizing that he talked about a small and big version of this, you know, APU architecture. And so perhaps the 9-watt version is a smaller CU version, but honestly, I don't think it has to be. What you're looking at here is the Xbox Series X die with 56 compute units in the full die and of course 8 Zen 2 cores. Although I will say this, I do have some information that both the PlayStation and Xbox may have some tweaks above standard Zen 2, but we won't get into that. Anyways, I have been told that what I was detailing in February is a streamlined version, like X Preview covered, compared to the console's larger APUs. So if we take this 360 millimeter square die, and then we just shave off, let's say about 42% of the compute units, what do we get to? Well, we get to something that I think is between 200 and 220 millimeters squared. That's Picasso size. That's normal for AMD to make an APU this big. A 200 millimeter squared die, depending on how thin it is, look, they already put a high-end version of Picasso in the Microsoft Surface Book. This will fit. This will fit in premium convertibles and larger tablets like Spectres and Surfaces, and maybe even, hopefully, as we've heard in rumors, in those ultra-thin Apple MacBooks. And targeting around 9 or 10 watts, it makes sense why they would use 24 compute units. Remember, I detailed this thing running at only 950 megahertz in the TDP down mode. That's less than half the frequency of Renoir. But it's over double the compute units. More compute units, clocked lower, they'll be fully saturated just at these levels. This makes a lot of sense for a low power APU for convertible tablets. And again, remember that they can still clock it higher if they want to and put it in something like an NV Spectre 15 or Dell XPS laptop, and it doesn't need a discrete graphics card. But yeah, so that's my thoughts on updating that, big APU bombshell leak I did in February once again. If this new set of information is correct, I was almost certainly detailing Van Gogh and not Cézanne. But we do know that both Van Gogh and Cézanne still seem to exist, and with interesting differences. Van Gogh, as I've detailed, has likely been tested for months now with Zen 2 and RDNA 2. So if that's true, why on earth would Cézanne come out after it with Zen 3 but still Vega? I'm guessing there's a lot of people, or at least I've seen, right, in comments, a lot of people go, that's depressing. Well, we were hoping Cézanne would be RDNA 2. This doesn't make any sense with them being released so close to each other. But I'm here to explain why it actually does make a lot of sense. When Zen first came out, remember that AMD really hadn't made any money yet. They were still scraping by, and so they were forced to design products that would cover broad parts of the market. Once they had, Picasso out, Picasso had to do a bunch of different things. But as I've been emphasizing in many videos, Renoir is just the start of their new approach, an approach that sees them launching an onslaught of multiple APUs at specific parts of the market. Eventually, I don't think AMD is just going to have one or two different mainstream APUs. I think they could have, 4 or 5 segments. Now, the first surgical strike of this multi-segment onslaught is Renoir. This is an APU that has serviceable graphics because, well, AMD is decent at graphics relative to Intel right now, but then also intelligently has a powerful CPU. They didn't just give it even 6 cores, they gave full Renoir 8 cores, and they chose to give it Vega, I believe, not just because of timing, but because it wastes very, very little die space. They know that an 8-core CPU, that is the Zen 2 derivative architecture, is going to be pretty damn good at gaming, and it's going to go into tons of laptops that come with graphics cards like an RTX 2060. So if you know this APU will be decent at gaming, do you really want to waste like half the die space on graphics? No, and if you look at Renoir, it looks like it's just about 25 to 40% of the die space. That's on purpose. Renoir is the budget, decent APU that actually has a decent CPU so that you can put this cheap APU in gaming notebooks. But then if you cut it down from 8 to 6 cores, that Vega 8 graphics card all of a sudden perfectly complements a 6-core in $500 laptops. This is the mainstream, inexpensive, wallet-friendly segment. And so this is where you go, wait a second, but why wouldn't they put Zen 3 in Van Gogh? Is there any good reason to do this? Well, yeah, and it's really the same reason they put Vega in Renoir. I'm sorry, guys, 8 Zen 2 cores? That's not going to be the bottleneck of 24 compute units. We've already seen that Zen 2 is very good at gaming. It can power high-end graphics cards. And so if Zen 3 has all of this cache takes up a lot of space. perhaps that's required to maximize its IPC gains. And so they might say, okay, if it's still on 7 nanometer, even if it's 7 nanometer EUV, this is not going to get any discrete graphics cards. There's no point in us giving it a more powerful Zen 3 CPU. Save die space on the 8-core. It's a perfect match for the more powerful, but still not super high-end RDNA 2 graphics. I do not believe going with Zen 2 and Van Gogh is an oversight or being lazy. It's a deliberate choice. AMD isn't stupid or lazy. They put Vega in Renoir because it doesn't take up a lot of space, and they know it's going to be paired with discrete cards. They're putting Zen 2 in Van Gogh because it's a plenty powerful enough CPU that doesn't require a lot of cache to get decent performance. It's sure as heck not going to bottleneck that 20 to 24 compute unit RDNA 2 graphics card. This is the start of their multi-segment pincer attack on Tiger Lake, and that gets us to answering the main question I posited. Why? Why would they go with Zen 3 and yet 7 nanometer Vega again in Cézanne? Well, because Cézanne is a direct replacement of Renoir if this recent leak is correct. It's going to still be paired with dedicated graphics cards. And so maybe they'll increase it to 10 compute units or 12. Each one of those compute units only takes up about 5 millimeters squared, but they don't need to put bigger RDNA 2 in there. They want compact, tight, dense Vega because it might have a discrete graphics card. And then, as detailed in that leak, Rembrandt's coming supposedly on 6 nanometer from TSMC that should have both Zen 3 and RDNA 2, and because it's on 6 nanometer, well, it'll be able to fit into a similar sized package, and that'll probably be the new thin and light champion. Although from the sounds of it, that might actually come to AM5, really with like a Zen 3 plus RDNA 2, and so I expect they might actually just end up using that in a whole bunch of things because it just looks impressive no matter how you dice it. So yeah, that's my explanation for why you will probably still see AMD using a variety of architectures even when new ones come out in specific APUs. These are surgical strikes at Intel in different segments. And look, I did label this as an observations and creative perspectives video. There's a lot of speculation here, so do take this with a, well, this is Tom's attempt to explain it. I'm not confirming everything I just said, like the fact that I suspect Zen 3 may need more cache to maximize IPC increases, all in that. But I think it makes sense, and I think I am definitely onto something. I mean, heck, this is kind of what Intel's doing right now with Tiger Lake when you see that they are launching a quad-core model first and then a larger 8-core model. But if all of what I'm saying right now ends up being true, I do think AMD's approach is a lot smarter and less, I don't know, scrambly, right? It kind of feels like Intel's scrambling, like they didn't think they would need 8-core Tiger Lake so soon. If you ask me, Intel should have not, increased execution units by 50% in Tiger Lake U over Ice Lake, right? They want a double graphics performance. Some of that will come from IPC, and some of that will come from moving to 96 execution units from Ice Lake 64. I think they should have just kept 64, clocked it a little faster because of the more enhanced 10 nanometer node, and given it IPC increases, and then given it 6 full cores. 6 full cores with that IPC on a ring bus architecture with less graphics could have allowed them to make it really directly compete with Renoir in every way, and then you can bring out the 8-core model, hopefully actually with 128 execution units so that it doesn't need a discrete card. I mean, heck, 128 execution units, I mean, yeah, that could compete probably with a GTX 1650. But that's just not what Intel's doing. They're rushing out a quad core that will have worse CPU performance than Renoir, although, better in single-threaded by probably about 10%, and then it will also have better graphics performance, but it's like 20% better graphics performance and something meant for premium notebooks anyways. I don't know. I think this is just going to end up getting crushed by Van Gogh. That's honestly what I think. But now I'm starting to get a little more and more off subject. That's really the gist of what I wanted to talk about. Why potentially AMD would go with Zen 3 plus Vega after they're already launching a Zen 2 plus RDNA 2. These are surgical strikes meant to maximize die space for the specific segments. remember that these are leapfrogging designs. That's another reason AMD will probably mix and match certain things. You know, if one comes out even just 3 or 4 months later, it will have a couple of new tweaks, even if part of its design feels older, and that there will be likely multiple versions of Cézanne, Van Gogh, and eventually Raphael. I mean, we already know that there were 12 CU versions of Renoir being tested, but we don't technically know if all of these versions being tested will ever come out. We just know that in addition to being all of these different artists' names out there in their own, complementary designs, there could also be bigger and smaller versions of them, making it even more confusing for leakers like me. And I know this is a little off subject, but these will also potentially have some new software coming to laptops soon. I have someone I spoke to who's working on some AMD programs, and it seems like AMD's laying the ground for a power slider and tweaking function to come standard in AMD laptops. This would be something where, like, if you have an AMD laptop, an APU that's self-contained, you might actually have the ability to go into the AMD drivers, and there will be a power slider for the CPU portion, not just the GPU. That way, if you like it to get a little hotter and have more performance, maybe if you're in a colder climate, you can do that. Or if you're someone like me and you love to undervolt and make the thing run at sustained clock speeds to your liking, you might be able to tweak it like that. It sounds like, actually, to me, AMD's a little unsure if they actually want to roll this out because they're worried about voiding warranties, and, AIBs and OEMs don't like this, but I really hope they do it, because I'm sorry, OEMs, you guys just can never get the power boosting and throttling to be what I think is well done. I'd always have to fix your laptops for you. So please, AMD, do this. If you release this power slider function for adjusting the CPU's performance in AMD laptops, I would maybe not even consider Intel anymore. And I guess another thing to say here before I close out is that I have zero indications that any of these APUs I mentioned, any of them, have HBM, except for maybe Raphael. Until Raphael, it sounds like it's just DDR4 and DDR4X, and then, DDR5 with Rembrandt, and so on and so forth. And I will be doing a video about that soon, why AMD continues to choose to not put HBM into almost any of its APU products, even though a lot of enthusiasts think that they obviously should have a while ago. It's more complicated than you might think, but when they do put HBM in, probably Raphael, I do have information that'll probably be to combat Intel's own 3D stacking designs. I'm of course talking about Meteor Lake, that is supposedly already working with TSMC on parts of its 3D stack design to be made over there on standard TSMC 7nm. I know that sounds like a weird move, but there's more to say about Meteor Lake as well, which is, in addition to working on an AMD HBM APU video, I also am starting to get some early information about Meteor Lake that should drop in 2022. But do not forget that 7nm 3D stacked Meteor Lake will most likely be competing with 3D stacked 5nm Zen 4. And yes, I'm aware that a rumor dropped right before I wanted to finish this video talking about Zen 3 potentially using N5P for a quick boost in both performance and efficiency at the last minute, before seemingly being debunked by the same website spreading these rumors. So I guess I have to comment on this. Look, I like DigiTimes. I've used their information in a lot of my videos and podcasts. They have a pretty decent track record where if they talk about something, there's at least some fire to the smoke, even if it all doesn't end up being true. So here's what I'm going to do. I don't have any information that Zen 3 is going to be on 5nm, and I've had multiple sources tell me it's still on track for the end of this year. I can make an argument for why AMD would do this, though, if it ends up being true, right? Let's see how good Matisse 2 is. If Matisse 2 really has an FCLK clock, at like 2000 megahertz, no drama overclocking with, standard support for 4000 megahertz memory, and it does on average boost, 10% higher all-core turbo in games, I could honestly see Matisse 2 actually outright defeat Comet Lake in gaming. Maybe not when Comet Lake's screaming at 5.2 gigahertz using 400 watts, but who cares? You know, it might actually be closer in gaming performance to Comet Lake than original Matisse 1 was to Coffee Lake. If that happens, and again, I'm not saying it will, but let's just say that does happen with Matisse 2, I could see why AMD doesn't feel rushed to release Zen 3. And I know Zen 4 is really, really ambitious based on what I'm being told. So perhaps they think Zen 4 is going to slip to mid 2020. What would that be then? 2022 instead of coming out late 2021. And with that in mind, why not take, a quarter to half a year to see if you can rapidly port Zen 3 to N5P? They would have actually had to have made this decision months ago, though, by the way, guys. They didn't just make it today. I guess that's my argument. I guess that would actually make some sense if AMD decided, Matisse 2 will defend the crown. Rocket Lake might be better at gaming, though. So let's just make sure Zen 3 is that little bit better to hold the crown in everything, including gaming, for a whole year. And if it was just a rapid port, they could put Zen 3 on 5 nanometer, which they were already planning to do with a Zen 3 Plus APU. So the work could have arguably already been started half a year ago, right? What they could do is not try to save any die space. They could just do a straight direct port to 5 nanometer, not wasting time, trying to optimize parts of the design, and just go, now we're on 5 nanometer. We're not going to do anything with density or architectural changes. We're just going to try to get a flat 10% higher clock speeds than Matisse 2 and maybe a 10% TDP reduction at the same time to give us that extra bit of edge in gaming and server for a year, since Zen 4 may take longer. That's my argument for if this rumor is true, why AMD would do it. But at the same time, my gut, and it could be wrong, tells me that something's off about that rumor. And if I'm AMD, even if Matisse 2 is as good as I say, right, wouldn't you want that guaranteed Zen 3 that's like another 10%, 20% better than that? Because that is going to take the gaming crown. That will almost certainly defeat even Rocket Lake. And if you can get the gaming champion architecture that everyone's been waiting for AMD to bring out in the holiday season with zero competition for a year, I think that's worth it over gaining that extra little bit of performance, even if Rocket Lake impresses. I just think that makes a lot more sense. If you're gonna crush Intel either way, you might as well do it sooner rather than later and make as much money during a holiday season if you can. That's just my opinion. Although, again, the one devil's advocate argument I would make against that is that we're in a recession. So maybe AMD thinks a high-end, preferably for them higher price, they probably want to raise prices with Zen 3, might not be the best thing to launch this holiday season over just reducing prices with some Zen 2 models and just making it stronger and better, hopefully when the recession's over early next year. That might be another argument for why AMD would do this. But again, I spoke to a couple of people, and again, I can't confirm names, but I'm talking people that work at foundries, and they're all like, I don't know how this could be possible. It could be possible. Everyone agrees it could be possible, but this would be an insane upset surprise. So that's what I'll say. I don't think that rumor is entirely going to pan out, but I do think it's plausible. So this is me also stating ahead of time, it's not entirely unrealistic. And that's really all I can say without my own information. But all of this will be in different videos, and I think I've said all I have to say in this one. So I really hope you enjoyed it. If you've been enjoying my videos, please subscribe. I'm trying to get to 64,000 subscribers. If you are a subscriber and you've been watching tons of my videos, remember to ring the bell button so you don't miss anything. Share my videos to support me. And, well, speaking of support, it really is the patrons making all this possible. You get tons of exclusive content weekly if you're a patron, and blah, blah, blah. Thank you for watching.